It's Miss Tremblay here, and today we're going to talk about how to do basic edits in Lightroom. So we are finally at the point where we can start to edit our photos. And so this is going to be really useful for those photos where you just have some minor issues with like cropping or with your exposure. It's not going to do a lot of good for those images that some of you are still struggling with, where you have really, really dark or really, really bright photograph. So it's only going to help you with images that are somewhat off from being properly exposed. So hopefully everybody knows this by now, but in order to edit an image, you're just going to click on it, and that should bring us to our edit menu. And so the first tool that we're going to talk about is the crop tool, because the crop tool is really easy to use and it's really easy to understand. So if I click over here on this weird triangle or this weird kind of square with arrows, that's our crop tool. And so along with your basic cropping, where you just drag the corners and crop in, you also have some other edits. So I'm going to hit done. I'm going to say, I want this photo to just be this duck. And so along with being able to crop, I can also flip and rotate. So flipping this guy sideways probably isn't going to do much for my photograph, but I could flip him in the opposite direction if I wanted to use the left to right rule, or in this case violate the left to right rule. I could flip him in multiple different directions so that he's upside down. And so that can be fun depending on what you're doing. And then we also have the straighten tool. So the straighten tool is really useful if you're taking photographs of like artwork. So if you're taking photos of like prints, like when we did our cyanotypes, and your photo isn't quite straight, you can use that straighten tool. And we need to give it a second as it thinks, and we can rotate our image with that straighten tool. So there are some really nice and useful tools here under crop, and the crop tool itself is pretty easy to use, but some of those other tools are tools that you might not have used before. One more thing that I want to show you guys with the crop tool, if you notice, when I drag the handle here, or even if I drag this side, the whole thing resizes. So it's not just this side that changes, it's everything that changes. And so that's what's called aspect ratio. So aspect ratio is just the ratio of your width to your height. And the computer's trying to keep that ratio the same because it assumes that you want to stay in that ratio since that's what you took the image in. So sometimes that's fine. This image just doesn't really matter. But sometimes, like if you're printing, or if you know that you want like a really like long skinny photo, or you want to crop out these two sides of the photo, we can change the aspect ratio. So we could do 1:1, we could do custom. So with custom, it's just going to let you drag the handle and only one side moves. So with this custom aspect ratio, we can move just the side that we're touching. So that can be really useful if you've got like a lot of extra information on like just one side of a photo, but you want to keep everything else. And changing aspect ratio can be really useful if you are trying to make like a photograph to fit in a specific size. So like Facebook, the banners have one size requirement, the profile photo has another. So this can be really useful if you're trying to size an image appropriately. So that is cropping, and cropping is pretty easy to understand. And now we're going to talk about exposure. So remember that exposure is how light or dark an image is. And when I click on this first set of controls, which is like little bars with sliders, I get several different options. So what we're going to focus on today is just the one that says light. So if I click that, sorry about the bell, guys, I get all kinds of different options that are just dealing with exposure. So the very first one is the one you're probably going to use the most often, which is called exposure. And that's just how bright or how dark the whole image is. So if I slide my slider over, I could brighten this up. I can get it too bright. I can kind of get it where I think that the exposure is better. So that can be really useful if you're somewhat underexposed or overexposed. Another one that I use a lot is contrast. So if you increase the contrast, you're going to darken your darks and lighten your whites. If you decrease, everything's kind of going to fade out. So I might decide that I want a really strong contrast. I might decide I don't want to touch that at all. And the nice thing about these sliders is you can go back and you can change them based on, you know, maybe one day you're looking at this in one light and you like it, and then you look at it again and you're like, that's not exactly what I was going for. So the nice thing about Lightroom is that I can edit this, I can close it, I can open it up again later. All my edits are already there and it's showing me exactly what I did. And so I can make adjustments without having to like go back and undo a lot. I can see exactly what changes I've made. So the other two sets of adjustments here with exposure are highlights and shadows, and then whites and blacks. So highlights are going to change all of your lighter values. Shadows are going to change all of your blacker values. Whites are only going to change your whites, and blacks are only going to change your blacks. So this is like changing contrast, but instead of changing whites and blacks at the same time, you're changing just one or the other, depending on what you're trying to do in your photo. So let's look at shadows, because I noticed that Miss Ruby's face is very dark. So let's see if we can adjust our shadows and actually brighten them up a little bit. And one thing that you're seeing that's happening, as I brighten my shadows, I'm starting to get some artifacts in here, meaning I'm starting to get areas that look really grainy and that don't make sense, like little white spots like in the middle of the black shadows, and I'm seeing them everywhere. And so this is one of the reasons why you want to have really good exposure, because I make some of these adjustments. If I go too far, then I kind of get this low quality image. Whereas if I just shot this with the right exposure in the first place, I wouldn't have to worry about these artifacts in there. So I can brighten this up a little bit, and then I could even adjust my blacks as well and see if maybe I can get her face a little brighter without having too much noise that's introduced into the rest of the image. If I wanted to make my highlights brighter or darker, I could do that as well. And I, of course, can also change my whites and make them whiter. So for right now, this menu, just the exposure menu and the cropping menu are the menus that I want you to use. Another trick with exposure that I like to use is if I'm really struggling to see like how my exposure is, I'll take a white piece of paper and I'll hold it up and I'll kind of check my whites in my photo against the white of the paper, and I will do that to something black as well if I feel like I need it, although I can usually tell when the blacks are like a pure black. And that can tell me if my contrast is good overall in the entire picture. And it can tell me if I maybe need to make some more adjustments to my general contrast. And some of this is just going to be learning how to look for contrast, look for subtle changes. Most of us can tell when an image is way too dark, or parts of an image are way too dark or way too light, but you're going to get an even more developed sense of that as you learn to make these adjustments and learn to really look at your photos. So this image is darker in real life. It is coming through a little lighter on the screen. And as I said, one of the great things about these controls is you can go back in and you can change things and you can play with these sliders, and the changes are not permanent. And so it's really easy to just kind of get used to these controls by using them on several different photos. So that is what we're going to be doing in Lightroom this week. It's pretty easy, and if we end up Hopping over to Photoshop, the controls are going to be fairly similar, and so we'll be doing fairly similar things if we do decide to move ahead and look at the Photoshop interface after we're done looking at Lightroom.